universe did not scream when it broke. It hummed, a low, bone-shaking vibration that turned Kalen Voss's vision into a smeared oil painting of violet and jagged gold. The cockpit of the Star Skipper Mark 7 hissed as the internal atmosphere bled into the void, the sound like a dying man's last breath. Red emergency strobes flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the flight console that reminded Kalen of a heartbeat. Fast, erratic, and terrified. Kalen gripped the manual override stick until his knuckles turned as white as the stars dying outside his viewport. His flight suit, a pressurized second skin of carbon weave and sensor leads, tightened around his chest as the ship's artificial intelligence gasped its final commands. Critical integrity failure in Sector 4 Bravo, the voice of the computer crackled, distorted by static. Structural shear imminent. Pilot ejection protocol is recommended. Stow that chatter, Kalen spat, his voice thick with the copper taste of blood from a bitten lip. I am not bailing out into a gravitational well with zero intel. Give me thrusters. Give me anything. The Star Skipper gave him a violent shudder instead. The ship had been part of a long-range reconnaissance sweep for the Solterran hegemony, looking for stable wormhole nodes beyond the Orion Spur. They had found one, but it wasn't a node. It was a maw, a rift in the fabric of space-time that had snapped shut like a predator's jaw, shearing the vessel's warp drive clean off and tossing the remaining fuselage into the atmosphere of a planet that shouldn't have been there. Kalen grunted as the first touch of the planet's thermosphere hit the hull. The screech of metal under thermal stress drowned out the alarms. Outside, the sky was no longer the black of the abyss. It was a bruised, swirling purple, thick with clouds that glowed with an internal, bioluminescent fire. He was falling. Really falling. Not the controlled descent of a landing craft, but the chaotic, tumbling plunge of a lead weight. Initiating emergency thruster burn, Kalen muttered, a mantra for the dying. 3, 2, 1. The impact of the deceleration burn slammed him back into his seat with the force of 10 gravities. His vision went black at the edges. He felt his ribs groan, one of them snapping with a sickening pop that he felt more than heard. The ship tore through a layer of clouds that felt as dense as water, and for a fleeting second, Kalen saw the world below. It was a nightmare of emerald and neon, forests of towering fungal structures that looked like umbrella-shaped skyscrapers covered the horizon. There were no oceans, only vast plains of glowing moss and rivers of liquid silver. Then came the canopy. The Star Skipper hit the trees, if they could be called that, at over 400 kilometers per hour. The sound was like 1,000 glass cathedrals shattering at once. Branches as thick as tank armor sheared through the wings, tearing the ship apart piece by piece. Kalen's head snapped forward as the cockpit module detached, spinning through the air like a discarded toy. Impact was a sudden, absolute silence. Kalen drifted in a sea of gray for what felt like centuries. When consciousness finally clawed its way back, it brought a symphony of pain. Every nerve in his body felt like it had been stripped of its insulation and rubbed with salt. He opened his eyes, but only one would cooperate. The other was sealed shut by a warm, sticky curtain of blood. The cockpit was an unrecognizable mess of twisted alloy and sparking wires. The smell of ozone and burnt insulation was overpowering, mixed with something else, something sweet, like overripe peaches and ozone. Survival. Step 1. Get out, he whispered. His voice was a raspy ghost. He fumbled for the release of his harness. His fingers were numb, fumbling with the heavy buckles. It took him 5 minutes of agonizing effort just to free himself. He tumbled out of the seat and onto the cracked glass of the viewport. Below him, the ground was a soft, undulating carpet of purple flora. Kalen dragged himself through the jagged hole where the hatch had been. He fell the last 2 meters, landing on his good shoulder and letting out a cry that was muffled by the thick, humid air. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, staring up at the sky. The clouds were thinning. Above him, 2 moons hung in the heavens, one a pale silver, the other a deep, pulsating rose. They were so large it felt like he could reach out and touch them. The air was heavy, saturated with moisture, and a faint shimmering dust that sparkled in the moonlight. I'm KIA, he thought with a grim smirk. I have to be. No one survives a lawn dart entry like that. But the pain in his leg, pinned under a piece of the outer hull, told him otherwise. He looked down and saw his flight suit was torn, the white fabric stained crimson. He gritted his teeth, found a sturdy branch of a fallen tree, and used it as a lever. With a roar of pure animal frustration, he shoved the metal plate off his limb. He was free, but he was a wreck. He reached for the emergency beacon on his belt, a standard-issue Solterran distress unit. He clicked the switch. Nothing. The casing was cracked, the internal crystal shattered into useless dust. Zero dark 30 and no comms, he muttered, the military slang a comfort in the encroaching dark. Just another day in the black. He tried to stand, but his left leg buckled. He collapsed against a tree that felt like velvet to the touch. The trunk was translucent, glowing with a soft, pulsing azure light. As his hand brushed the bark, the glow intensified, rippling upward like a silent alarm. The forest was not quiet. It breathed. He heard the rustle of leaves that sounded like silk rubbing against silk. He heard the distant melodic call of something that wasn't a bird. And then he heard the whispers. They weren't human. Not exactly. They were musical, a series of clicks and elongated vowels that seemed to vibrate in the air rather than travel through it. Kalen reached for the sidearm at his hip, a pulse pistol. His holster was empty. It must have been ripped away during the tumble. He was unarmed, broken, and stranded on a world that felt like a beautiful, predatory dream. "Who's there?" he barked, trying to inject some authority into his cracking voice. "Show yourselves!" The whisper stopped. The forest held its breath. Then a small stone hit the smoldering wreckage of his ship, scattering sparks into the air. Kalen turned his head sharply, his vision swimming. In the shadows between the glowing trees, he saw them. Tall, slender figures with skin that seemed to drink the moonlight. They moved with a fluid grace that made his human movements seem clumsy and tectonic. There were 5 of them at first, then 10. They didn't carry guns. They carried spears made of obsidian and bone, tipped with crystals that hummed with the same azure light as the trees. Their hair was long, flowing like liquid silver or midnight silk. Their eyes were huge, lacking pupils, glowing with a steady golden radiance. And as they stepped into the light of his burning ship, Kalen felt a cold realization wash over him. They were all women, every single one of them. One figure stepped forward. She was taller than the others, her face marked with intricate, glowing tattoos that mirrored the constellations above. She looked at him not with fear, nor with the curiosity one shows a guest. She looked at him with the clinical, detached gaze of a scientist looking at a fossil that had suddenly started to twitch. She pointed a spear at his chest. The tip hovered centimeters from his heart. "What are you?" she asked. The words weren't English, or any language known to the hegemony, but through the lingering neuro-link in his brain, the meaning bled through, translated by the raw intent behind her voice. "Kalen Voss, pilot," he croaked, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'm just a man." The woman's golden eyes widened. A ripple of sound went through the group behind her, a collective gasp that sounded like a wind through a canyon. She stepped closer, her spear never wavering. She reached out with her free hand and touched the fabric of his flight suit, then the skin of his neck. Her fingers were as cold as ice. "A man," she whispered, the words sounding like a curse and a prayer combined. Before Kalen could answer, the world tilted again. The loss of blood, the shock, and the strange, sweet scent of the forest finally took their toll. As he slumped into the purple moss, the last thing he saw was the woman's face, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly devoid of mercy. Waking up felt like being pulled through a straw. Kalen's mind reassembled itself in fragments. The hum of the ship, the tearing sky, the golden eyes in the dark. He expected the harsh, sterile smell of a med bay. Instead, he smelled jasmine and damp earth. He opened his eyes. He was lying on a bed of woven fibers that felt softer than any memory foam. Above him, the ceiling was a vaulted dome of living wood, the branches woven together so tightly that not even the rain could get through. Soft blue moss grew in the crevices, providing a gentle, ambient light that didn't hurt his eyes. He tried to sit up, and a sharp spike of pain in his ribs reminded him of his mortality. "Easy there, flyboy," he muttered to himself. "Sit rep. Check your vitals." His leg was wrapped in a translucent, jelly-like substance held in place by broad leaves. To his shock, the throbbing ache was gone, replaced by a cooling sensation that seemed to penetrate deep into the bone. His chest was also bound in a similar fashion. They had healed him, or at least they were trying to keep the specimen alive. He looked around the room. It wasn't a room, it was a sanctuary. There were no hard angles. Everything was curved, organic, and purposeful. Stone jugs sat on a low table filled with clear water. A small bowl contained fruits that looked like translucent rubies. There were no bars on the door, but Kalen wasn't fooled. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. He slid his legs off the bed, testing his weight. His left leg held. The biojelly was a miracle of engineering, or nature. He hobbled toward the entrance, a simple archway covered by a curtain of shimmering beads. He pulled them aside and stepped out. The sight that met him took the air from his lungs. He was in a village carved into the side of a massive cliff. Stone houses, smoothed by centuries of wind and water, clung to the rock faces like swallows' nests. Bridges of woven vines and translucent glass spanned the gaps between the dwellings. Below, a waterfall of liquid silver tumbled into a basin 300 meters down, sending up a mist that caught the morning light and turned it into 1,000 rainbows. And everywhere there were women, hundreds of them. They moved with a serene, rhythmic pace. Some carried baskets of glowing fungi, others sat in circles, weaving what looked like shimmering cloth out of thin air. Children, all girls, Kalen noticed with a jolt, played near the water's edge, their laughter sounding like the chiming of bells. The village fell silent the moment he stepped out. It was a physical wave of quiet that started near his hut and spread like a ripple in a pond. Every head turned. Every pair of golden eyes locked onto him. It wasn't a hostile gaze. It was a look of profound, unsettling intensity. It was the way a starving man looks at a loaf of bread, or how a believer looks at a miracle they never expected to see. Kalen's hand went instinctively to his empty holster. He felt naked. He felt like an ant under a magnifying glass. "Back away, Voss," he whispered to himself. "You're the only Y chromosome in a 1,000-mile radius. That makes you a target." He turned to go back into the hut, but a figure blocked his path. It was the woman from the crash site. She was taller up close, her skin a pale, pearlescent violet that seemed to glow from within. She wore a robe of dark silk, and her silver hair was tied back with cords of bone. "My name is Eris Vey," she said. This time the translation in his head was clearer. The hegemony's neural dampener, though damaged, was trying to calibrate to the frequency of their speech. It was a crude telepathic resonance. "Where am I?" Kalen asked, his voice sounding gravelly and harsh compared to her melodic tones. "You are in Ethelgard," she replied, "the last sanctuary of the Vi Solari. You are the first who has come from the Great Tearing in 20 generations. The Great Tearing. He assumed she meant the rift. 20 generations. If their generations were anything like humans, that was hundreds of years. "I need to fix my ship," Kalen said, stepping forward. "I have people who will come looking for me. If you help me, the hegemony will reward you. We have technology, medicine." Eris Vey's expression didn't change, but her eyes dimmed slightly. "Your ship is dust, Kalen Voss. The sky on Honduras does not give back what it takes. And as for your people, they are a myth here. A ghost story we tell to children." She stepped closer, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something human in her. Sadness. "You do not understand," she said softly. "You are not a guest, and you are not a prisoner. You are a biological impossibility." "Why?" Kalen demanded. "Where are the men? There has to be a base, a city, somewhere." Eris Vey reached out, her fingers hovering just above the scar on his cheek. "We ended the chaos 5,000 years ago," she said. "The seed of the Y chromosome was a plague of war, of fire, and of greed. We chose a different path. We chose the silence." Kalen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They didn't just lose their men, they had purged them, or evolved past them. Then why keep me alive, he asked, his jaw tightening. If I'm a plague, why not just finish the job? Because, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear, the silence is becoming too loud. Our people are fading. The spores that give us life are thinning. We thought we had achieved perfection, but we have only achieved a slower death. She looked past him, at the hundreds of women watching them from the cliffs. They think you are a god, Kalen Voss. I think you are a dangerous, chaotic relic of a past we tried to bury. But we are both wrong. You are a chance. A chance for what? She didn't answer. She turned and signaled to two guards, women with shoulders like warriors and spears that crackled with energy. Keep him fed. Keep him safe, RSV commanded, and do not let any of the sisters touch him. Not yet. As she walked away, Kalen looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He was a soldier, a pilot, a man of action. But here, in this beautiful, stagnant paradise, he was something he had never been before. He was a resource. That night, as the rose moon rose over the cliffs, a young woman slipped past the guards. She didn't have the cold, regal bearing of Eris Vey. She looked younger, her golden eyes wide with a terrifying curiosity. She sat at the edge of his bed while he pretended to sleep. She reached out and touched his hand, her breath catching in her throat. Warm, she whispered. You are so warm. Kalen opened his eyes. This was Lyra Na, he would later learn, the girl who would change everything. What do you want? He asked. I want to know, she said, her voice trembling. Is it true? In the world beyond the sky, do people really die for love? Kalen looked at her, then at the silent, glowing forest outside. We die for a lot of things, kid. Love is just the only one that makes any sense. She smiled then, and for a moment, the alien world didn't feel so alien. But as he watched her disappear into the shadows, Kalen knew one thing for certain. The silence was about to be broken, and he was the hammer. The morning light on Honduras did not break the horizon so much as it dissolved into it. The purple sky shifted into a bruised shade of orange, and the bioluminescent trees dimmed their glow, yielding to the twin suns that hung like gold coins in the hazy atmosphere. Kalen Voss sat on the edge of his woven bed, his teeth gritted as the bio-stitch microorganisms crawled beneath his skin. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles were knitting his muscle fibers back together, an itchy, burning sensation that made him want to claw his own flesh off. Easy, Voss, he whispered to himself, his voice sounding like dry gravel. Do not touch the merchandise. He looked down at his leg. The translucent jelly had turned a murky brown, indicating that it had absorbed the toxins and bruising from his system. He peeled back a corner of the leaf bandage. The jagged tear in his thigh, which should have required 30 stitches and a month of physical therapy, was now a thin, pink line. It was medical tech that would have made the Solterran surgeons back on Mars green with envy. He stood up, testing his weight. His leg held. He was still stiff, and his ribs felt like they were being squeezed by a heavy-duty hydraulic press, but he was mobile. In his line of work, mobile was as good as indestructible. He needed to find his bearings. He needed a sit rep on the wreckage of his ship, and more importantly, he needed to know if he was the only ground pounder left in this corner of the galaxy. He pushed aside the bead curtain and stepped into the dizzying height of Ethelgard. The village was already humming with activity. He watched as a group of women in shimmering leaf-spun tunics hauled large, translucent gourds up a series of pulley systems. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency. There was no shouting, no barking of orders, just a rhythmic coordination that felt almost hive-like. He began to walk along the narrow stone ledge that served as the main thoroughfare. The women he passed stopped in their tracks, their golden eyes tracking him with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. Some looked fearful, clutching their children closer. Others looked at him with a raw, naked fascination that made him feel like a prize stallion at a county fair. He reached a wide plaza where a giant, pulsating flower sat in the center, its petals spanning at least 20 meters. It looked like a heart made of velvet, and from its center, a fine, golden mist drifted into the air. Heads up, Voss. Company coming, he muttered. Eris Vey was waiting for him on the far side of the plaza. She stood with her arms crossed, her silver hair catching the morning light like a polished blade. Beside her stood several warriors, their radiant spears held at the ready. "You heal quickly for a creature made of such violent architecture," Vespera said, her voice echoing in his mind through the damaged neurolinker. Kalen stopped 5 meters away, keeping his hands visible. "We're tougher than we look. Where's the rest of my gear? My beacon, my sidearm, my rations. I need them back." "The things you brought are broken," she replied calmly. "They are relics of a world that thrives on noise. On Ondaris, we value the silence. Your tools are being studied." "Studied?" Kalen felt a surge of heat in his chest. "That's military hardware, lady. It's not a science project. You start poking around in that power cell without the right specs, and you're going to turn this pretty little village into a smoking crater. Stow the curiosity and give me my property." Vespera stepped forward, her golden eyes narrowing. "You speak of craters and power. Always the language of destruction. Do you know why there are no others like you here, Kalen Voss? Do you know why the sky is empty of your kind?" Kalen let out a short, cynical laugh. "I'm guessing you did a bit of spring cleaning 5,000 years ago." "We did what was necessary to survive," she said, her voice dropping to a low, cold vibration. "The men of the old world were a fire that consumed everything it touched. They turned the soil into ash and the water into poison. When the Great Tearing happened, the women of Ondaris made a choice. We did not purge the men. We simply stopped feeding the fire. We let the old ways die, and we built something that could endure." Kalen looked around at the peaceful, quiet village. "And look at you now. You're dying anyway," Lyra Na told me. "Your spores are failing. You're fading into the dark because you were too afraid of a little heat." One of the warriors took a step toward him, her spear humming with a dangerous azure light. Vespera held up a hand to stop her. "Lyra Na is young and full of dreams that have no roots," the sage said. "But she is right about one thing. We are at a crossroads. That is why I have decided to show you the truth of our history. Perhaps then you will understand why you can never leave." She turned and began walking toward a massive archway carved into the base of the cliff. Kalen hesitated for a second, then followed. He didn't have much choice. Without his gear and away off this rock, he was just a tourist in a very dangerous neighborhood. They entered a long, winding tunnel lit by glowing veins of mineral ore. The air grew cooler and smelled of ancient dust and ozone. After several minutes of walking, the tunnel opened into a vast, subterranean chamber. Kalen stopped, his jaw dropping. It was an archive. Thousands of shelves were carved into the rock, filled with glowing crystal cylinders and stone tablets. In the center of the room, a holographic projector, far more advanced than anything Kalen had seen in the hegemony, flickered with the image of a rotating star system. "This is the archive of sunken stars," Vespera said. "Everything we were, and everything we have become, is recorded here." Kalen walked toward a shelf and picked up a crystal cylinder. It felt warm to the touch. As his skin made contact, a series of images flashed through his mind. Burning cities, massive metal ships clashing in the void, and a sky that was literally being torn apart by jagged rifts of purple energy. "The Great Tearing," he whispered. "It wasn't a natural disaster." "No," Vespera said, standing beside him. "It was a war between your ancestors. They fought over the resources of this sector until they broke the very fabric of space. Ondaris was a garden world, a neutral ground. When the rifts opened, the men who were stationed here tried to use the planet as a battery to power their weapons. They would have drained the life out of everything to win a battle that had no meaning." "So the women revolted," Kalen guessed. "We did more than revolt. We bonded with the planet. We discovered the spores of the mother flower could sustain us, could allow us to bring forth life without the need for the conflict-driven biology of the male. We sealed the rifts, or so we thought. But the price was our connection to the stars. We chose to be lost." Kalen put the cylinder back, his mind racing. "You didn't just choose to be lost. You chose to be a dead end. You've got all this tech, all this knowledge, and you're just sitting here waiting for the lights to go out. That's not survival, Sage. That's a slow-motion suicide." "Is it?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Look at your world, Kalen. Is it not just a faster version of the same thing? You fall from the sky in a ship designed to kill, carrying weapons designed to destroy. You are the chaos we escaped. Kalen felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it down. He wasn't a philosopher, he was a pilot. I didn't come here to start a war. I was doing my job. Your job is to find paths for your people to follow, she said. And if you find a path to Andros, they will come with their fires and their hunger. That is why you must remain. You are the last man we will ever see, and you will be the last secret we ever keep. Erisve turned to leave, her warriors following her. Kalen was left alone in the archive, the weight of 5,000 years of history pressing down on him. He walked deeper into the chamber, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He found a section in the back that felt different. The crystals here were dusty, as if they hadn't been touched in centuries. He reached out and brushed the dust off a small, rectangular object. It wasn't a crystal, it was a data slate. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that design. It was a Mark IV Sol-Terran military slate. He picked it up, his hands trembling. He pressed the power stud. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered to life, glowing with a dim green light. File found. Captain Elias Thorne. Log entry. Day 412. Kalen's breath hitched. He wasn't the first. The entry began to play, the voice of the man sounding haunted and exhausted. If anyone is reading this, don't believe the silence. They didn't just stop feeding the fire. They locked the doors. The rifts aren't closed. They're just waiting for a catalyst. I found the signal source at the old shore. If I can reach it, I can get a message out. But the vanguard is everywhere. They don't want the sky to open. They'd rather we all die in the dark. The log ended abruptly with the sound of a spear humming and a short, sharp cry. Kalen stared at the screen, the green light reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't just a guest or a prisoner. He was a witness to a crime that had been going on for 5 millennia. Check your 6, Voss, he whispered. The game just changed. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. He shoved the data slate into his flight suit just as Lyrana stepped out from behind a pillar. You should not be back here, she said, her golden eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The sage says the deep archive is for the elders only. Kalen turned, trying to look nonchalant. Just doing a little light reading, kid. Listen, you know a place called the Old Shore? Lyrana paled, her skin shimmering with a nervous light. The Old Shore is forbidden. It is where the skeletons of the sky monsters lie. It is a place of ghosts and poison. No one goes there. I need to go there, Kalen said, stepping closer to her. I think there's something there that can save your people. And mine. Lyrana looked at him, her lips trembling. If they catch us, they will send us to the quiet chambers. We will never see the light again. Kalen reached out and gently touched her shoulder. His hand felt massive and clumsy against her delicate frame, but he kept his voice steady. I've spent my whole life flying through the dark, Lyra. The only way to find the light is to keep moving. Are you with me? Lyrana looked at the ground, then back up at him. She took a deep breath. I know a way out through the water tunnels, she whispered. But we must move fast. The moonwatch begins in 2 hours. Roger that, Kalen said, a grim smile touching his lips. Let's bug out. The water tunnels were a claustrophobic nightmare. Kalen and Lyrana waded through waist-deep, glowing liquid that felt like warm mercury. The walls were slick with bioluminescent algae that hissed whenever their bodies brushed against it. Kalen's ribs were screaming at him with every movement, but he pushed the pain into a small, dark corner of his mind and locked it away. Heads up, he whispered as they reached a fork in the tunnel. Which way? Left, Lyrana breathed. It leads to the drainage vents behind the great waterfall. From there, it is a 3-kilometer trek through the red thicket to reach the shore. 3 kilometers, Kalen thought. In his current state, that might as well be 3 light years. But he didn't say it. He just nodded and followed her. They emerged from the vents behind a thundering curtain of silver water. The noise was deafening, a constant, low-frequency roar that vibrated in Kalen's marrow. They scrambled down a jagged rock face and into the red thicket. The plants here were different from the village. They were sharp, thorny, and deep crimson, looking like veins of blood frozen in time. The air was thick with a heavy, metallic mist that made Kalen's lungs burn. Stay close, Lyrana warned. The thorns are filled with a numbing agent. If you get scratched, you will not feel your limbs for hours. Got it, Kalen said, carefully picking his way through the brush. Why is this place so different from the rest of the forest? This is the scar, she said, her voice sad. This is where the sky bled when the rifts opened. The life here is angry. It remembers what was done to it. They walked in silence for over an hour, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the crystalline soil. As they moved, Kalen noticed something strange. The mist began to thin, and the ground began to level out. The red plants gave way to vast open plains of gray sand, littered with twisted shards of rusted metal. The old shore, Lirina whispered. It was a graveyard. Dozens of ships, some as large as cruisers, lay half buried in the sand. They were ancient designs, predating the Solterran hegemony by centuries. They were the ships of the old war, the ones that had broken the sky. Kalen walked toward a massive hull that stood upright like a tombstone. Faded markings were still visible on the metal. Vanguard 1. This was the flagship, Kalen realized. This is where Thorn's signal came from. He began to search the perimeter of the wreck. The sand was heavy and wet, smelling of ancient salt and decay. He found a jagged hole in the side of the hull and climbed inside, pulling Lirina up after him. The interior of the ship was a hollowed-out skeleton. Cables hung like frozen vines from the ceiling, and the deck was covered in a layer of fine white dust. Kalen used the glow from his neurolinker to light the way. He found the bridge at the top of a tilted gantry. Most of the consoles were smashed beyond repair, but in the center of the room sat a single, reinforced pedestal. On top of it was a dish-shaped device made of polished obsidian and gold. The beacon, Kalen said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. He reached out and touched the device. It was cold, but as he ran his fingers over the surface, a faint blue light began to pulse deep within the obsidian. It's still active, he said, his heart pounding. It's been drawing power from the planet's magnetic field for 5,000 years. It's a passive receiver transmitter. Can it send a message? Lirina asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Kalen examined the interface. It didn't use standard buttons. It was a haptic interface designed to respond to neural impulses. He took a deep breath and placed his hand on the center of the dish. He closed his eyes and focused. He thought of the stars, of the cold black of the void, of the call signs of the Solterran fleet. He thought of the word survivor. The device hummed, the vibration rising in pitch until it was a piercing whine. The blue light flared, filling the bridge with a blinding radiance. I've got it, Kalen shouted over the noise. It's locking onto a carrier wave. But before he could complete the transmission, a cold, hard voice cut through the light. Step away from the machine, Kalen Voss. Kalen spun around, his hand going to his belt before remembering he was unarmed. Eris Vey stood at the entrance to the bridge, her silver hair flowing behind her like a shroud. Behind her were 6 warriors, their spears leveled at his chest. You followed us, Kalen said, his voice tight. We have always known of this place, the sage said, stepping into the bridge. We left it here as a reminder of our shame. But you have turned it into a weapon once again. I'm not making a weapon, Kalen snapped. I'm making a phone call. Your people are dying, Eris Vey. You're starving for genetic diversity, and your planet is literally falling apart. If I send this signal, my people can come here. We can help you fix this. Help us? Eris Vey laughed, a sound that was devoid of any humor. Like you helped the worlds you conquered? Like you helped the atmosphere of Mars before you turned it into a factory? We know your history, pilot. We have watched the stars for 5,000 years. We have seen your hegemony grow like a cancer. We will not let you bring that sickness here. It's not a sickness, Lirina shouted, stepping in front of Kalen. It's life. We are tired of the silence, Mother. We are tired of fading away. Look at him. He is chaos, yes, but he is also fire, and we are so cold. Eris Vey's face softened for a fraction of a second, a look of profound sorrow crossing her features. Lirina, you do not understand the weight of what you are asking. To bring the sky down to Honduras is to end our world. Then maybe our world needs to end so a new one can begin, Lirina replied, her voice steady. Eris Vey sighed and looked at her warriors. Take the girl, destroy the machine, and the man. He has proven too dangerous for the sanctuary. Take him to the Cliffs of Sorrows." The warriors moved with lightning speed. Kalen ducked a spear thrust and swung a heavy piece of rusted pipe he had found on the deck. He hit the first warrior in the shoulder, the metal clanging against her bioarmor. "Go loud, Voss," he roared, swinging the pipe again. He managed to knock back two of them, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. A spear butt slammed into his injured ribs, and he went down with a gasp. He saw two warriors grab Lyrana, who was screaming and fighting with everything she had. "Stop!" Kalen choked out, crawling toward Erisve. "Leave her out of this. It was my idea. I'm the one you want." Erisve looked down at him, her golden eyes cold and distant. "You are right about one thing, Kalen. You are a catalyst, but not the kind you think." She raised her hand, and the warriors dragged Lyrana out of the bridge. Erisve turned to the beacon. She didn't use a hammer or a weapon. She simply placed her hand on the obsidian and whispered a single word in her own tongue. The device shattered, not into pieces but into liquid shadow, flowing off the pedestal and soaking into the deck like ink. The light died instantly, leaving the bridge in total darkness. "The signal is gone," she said, "and so is your hope." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the hollow ship. Kalen lay on the floor, his vision swimming, the taste of blood in his mouth once again. He had failed. He had tried to be the hero, to be the bridge between two worlds, and all he had done was get a young girl imprisoned and destroy the only way home. He pulled the data slate from his suit. The screen was cracked, but it was still glowing with that dim, green light. "Don't believe the silence," Thorne's voice whispered in his mind. Kalen closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. He was beaten, broken, and buried in the belly of a ghost ship. But as he felt the cold metal of the deck beneath him, a new feeling began to stir. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't despair. It was a slow, burning rage. "You want the silence, Orisve?" he whispered into the dark. "Fine, but I'm going to make sure it's the loudest thing you've ever heard." He dragged himself up, using the pedestal for support. His ribs were on fire, and his head felt like it was in a vice, but he wasn't dead yet. And in the Sol Terran military, you weren't out of the fight until they were tagging your toe. "Time to bug out," he muttered. "But this time, I'm not running away. I'm going to find where they took her." He hobbled toward the exit, the green light of the data slate guiding him through the skeleton of Vanguard 1. Outside, the twin moons were setting, and the sky was turning a deep, angry red. The storm was coming, not just a storm of wind and rain, but a storm of fire that had been building for 5,000 years. Kalen Voss stepped out onto the gray sand, a lone man against an entire world. He was foobar, out of ammo, and half dead. Perfect, he thought, just the way I like it. The sky above the Cliffs of Sorrows did not hold the bruised purple of the lower valleys. Here, at the atmospheric ceiling of Honduras, the heavens were a jagged, electric white, torn by perpetual dry lightning that never touched the ground. Kalen Voss clung to a ridge of obsidian glass, his fingers bleeding through his torn flight gloves. The wind screamed past him, a cold, hungry sound that seemed to carry the voices of the ghosts Elias Thorne had mentioned in his logs. "Focus, Voss," he hissed, his lungs burning with the thin, metallic air, one hand over the other. "Don't go tango uniform now." His ribs were a choir of agony, each breath a sharp reminder of the spear butt that had cracked his side back at the wreck. He had been moving for nearly 6 hours, a forced march through the most treacherous terrain he had ever encountered. The cliffs were not just a geological formation, they were a cemetery of tectonic plates, forced upward during the Great Tearing. The stone was brittle, infused with the rusted remains of ancient satellites and orbit bombers that had rained down like iron hail 5,000 years ago. He pulled himself onto a narrow ledge and collapsed, his heart hammering against his chest like a trapped bird. He reached into his suit and pulled out the cracked data slate. The battery was at 12%. "Log entry," Kalen muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm Oscar Mike to the holding cells. The sage took Lyrana. If I don't reach her before the moon peak, I'm guessing she's headed for a permanent quiet chamber. The local flora is getting weirder. The glow isn't blue anymore. It's a sickly, pale yellow, like the planet's got a fever. He looked out over the edge. Below him, the Vesalari village was a cluster of glowing embers in the dark. But from this height, he could see what the villagers seemingly couldn't or wouldn't. The great mother flower at the center of the plaza was wilting. Its petals, which had looked so vibrant from the ground, were translucent and frayed at the edges. The golden mist it released was thinning, turning into a gray soot that settled on the roofs of the houses. The silence isn't a choice, Kalen realized, a cold shiver running down his spine. It's a symptom. He looked at the yellow spores clinging to the rocks around him. They weren't just seeds, they were tiny biological machines. He watched as one drifted onto the back of his hand. It didn't just sit there, it vibrated, trying to find a pore to enter. He brushed it off with a curse. They're not just feeding these women, he thought, they're modulating them. The realization hit him like a kinetic slug. The Vi Solari hadn't just evolved to be peaceful, they had been biologically dampened. The spores acted as a natural sedative, a neuroinhibitor that suppressed the high-alpha brain waves associated with aggression, curiosity, and, ultimately, change. Erisve and her elders had maintained this perfection for millennia, but the system was finally crashing. The planet was running out of the raw materials to keep the sedative cocktail stable. "You're not a sanctuary," he whispered toward the distant village. "You're an apothecary of the dying." Suddenly, the air behind him shimmered. Kalen didn't wait to see who it was. He rolled to the left, his hand grabbing a jagged shard of obsidian from the ground. A spear of azure light hissed through the space where his head had been a second before. "Stay down, human," a voice commanded. Kalen scrambled to his feet, his back against the cliff wall. 3 warriors stood on the ledge, their faces hidden behind masks of woven bone. They didn't move with the grace of the weavers in the plaza. They moved with the lethal precision of predators. These were the vanguard, the elite guardians Erisve kept in the shadows. "You've got a real habit of crashing parties, ladies," Kalen said, his eyes darting between the 3 spears. "But I'm in a bit of a rush. How about we skip the interrogation, and you just tell me where they've got the girl?" The lead warrior stepped forward, her spear humming a low, menacing note. "You have brought the taint of the old world into our home. You have poisoned a daughter of Ondaris with thoughts of the sky. There is no place for you in the silence." Kalen felt a surge of that old, familiar heat in his blood. The chaos Erisve feared so much. "You want to talk about poison? Look at your flower. Look at your sky. You're choking on your own peace. You're so afraid of a little friction that you're letting your whole species go dark. That's not a world. That's a tomb." The warrior lunged. Kalen parried the spear with his obsidian shard, the impact numbing his arm. He stepped inside her guard, slamming his elbow into her masked face. The bone cracked, and she stumbled back. The other 2 closed in. Kalen knew he couldn't win a stand-up fight. He was a pilot, not a commando, and he was working with half a functional ribcage. He looked at the edge of the cliff, then back at the warriors. One of them thrust her spear, the energy tip grazing Kalen's shoulder, melting the fabric of his flight suit and searing the skin beneath. He gritted his teeth, refusing to give them a scream. "Is that all you got?" he spat, blood flecking his lips. "I've had rougher turbulence on a cargo run to Titan." He saw the warrior hesitate, a flicker of doubt, a momentary lapse in the perfect silence. That was all he needed. He didn't attack. Instead, he reached into his suit and pulled out a small metallic cylinder, an emergency flare he'd scavenged from the wreckage of Vanguard 1. "Close your eyes, girls," he muttered. He twisted the cap. A blinding magnesium white light erupted from his hand, a scream of artificial brilliance that shattered the twilight of the cliffs. The warriors shrieked, clutching their sensitive golden eyes. The spores in the air ignited in a chain reaction, creating a cloud of sparkling fire that acted as a makeshift smokescreen. Kalen didn't stick around to admire the view. He turned and leaped off the ledge, not toward the village, but toward a lower outcropping he'd spotted earlier. He hit the slope hard, sliding down the scree, the sharp rocks tearing at his suit. He tumbled 20 meters, coming to a stop in a thicket of yellow, wilting fungi. He lay there for a minute, gasping for air, the world spinning in circles. His shoulder was a map of fire, and his vision was swimming with white spots from the flare. "Whiskey Tango Foxtrot," Voss, he groaned, dragging himself to his knees. Remind me to never do that again. He looked up. The warriors were still on the ridge, silhouettes against the electric sky. They were searching, but the flare had scorched the local bionetwork, blinding their empathetic tracking for a few precious minutes. He began to crawl through the fungi, the yellow dust coating his skin. He could feel the spores trying to work their magic on him, a heavy, dull lethargy creeping into his limbs. But his adrenaline was too high, his heart too loud. The plague of his biology was his only armor. He reached the base of the great spire, the highest point of the village where the elders held their councils. There, in a cage of amber light suspended over the abyss, he saw her. Lyra. She wasn't fighting. She was sitting perfectly still, her eyes closed, her skin a dull, lifeless gray. They were pumping her full of the concentrated spores, forcing her back into the silence. They weren't just punishing her, they were erasing her. Kalen gripped the stone until his fingernails cracked. He had spent his life following orders, flying paths laid out by generals and bureaucrats. He had seen worlds burned and people forgotten in the name of the greater good. He had always been a cog in the machine. But as he looked at the girl who had risked everything to show him a broken beacon, he realized that diversity wasn't just about different faces or different worlds. It was about the right to be loud, the right to be messy, the right to be alive. I'm coming for you, kid, he whispered, and I'm bringing the whole damn sky with me. The great spire felt like a needle piercing the heart of the world. As Kalen climbed the outer lattice of the structure, the wind began to carry a new sound, a low rhythmic thrumming that made his teeth ache. It was the resonance. In the Sol Terran military, they called it psychological warfare. Here it was a holy ritual. The elders of the Vi Solari were gathering, their voices joining in a single harmonic frequency designed to harmonize the village and purify the dissenters. Kalen reached the upper balcony, pulling himself over the railing with a grunt of effort. He stayed low, moving through the shadows cast by the massive glowing crystals that powered the spire's levitation field. The council chamber was an open-air amphitheater. 12 elders sat in a circle, their silver hair braided with dark pearls. In the center, Lyra was suspended in the amber cage, her body drifting in the thick golden mist of the spores. Eris Vey stood before her, her arms raised, her voice leading the chant. The sound was beautiful, Kalen had to admit. It was a perfect, seamless weave of melody. But as he listened, he felt the horror of it. There were no discords, no individual notes. It was a vacuum of personality, a collective ego that swallowed everything it touched. He checked his data slate. 5%. Time to drop the beat, he muttered. He didn't have a weapon, but he had something better. He had the data slate, and he had the audio logs of 5,000 years of human grief, anger, and hope. He had the record of the chaos they so feared. He crawled toward the central crystal, the heart of the spire's acoustic network. If he could patch the slate into the resonance chamber, he could break the frequency. He found the interface, a series of organic filaments that responded to bioelectric impulses. He didn't have the right biology, but he had the biostitch jelly on his wounds. He smeared a handful of the cooling sludge onto the filaments, creating a bridge between his tech and their nature. The filaments hissed and turned a bright, angry red. Eris Vey stopped chanting. She turned her head, her golden eyes scanning the shadows. She felt the discord. The silence was being scratched. Kalen Voss, she said, her voice echoing through the spire. Step into the light. Do not hide like the vermin of the old world. Kalen stood up. He walked into the center of the amphitheater, his flight suit tattered, his face smeared with blood and yellow dust. He looked like a demon in a garden of porcelain dolls. Let her go, Eris Vey, Kalen said. His voice was small against the vastness of the spire, but it was sharp. The elders stood, their faces twisting in a synchronized expression of disgust. You do not belong here, creature, one of them said. Your presence is a bruise upon the world. I'm a bruise? Kalen laughed, and the sound was a jagged rock thrown into a still pond. Look at yourselves. You're so terrified of a little noise that you're lobotomizing your own children. You think you're saving them? You're just making sure they're too quiet to scream when the end comes. He held up the data slate. I've got 5,000 years of noise on this little box, he said. I've got the songs of people who loved and fought and failed. I've got the screams of the great tearing, and I've got the truth about why you're really afraid of men. Arisve stepped forward, her skin shimmering with a cold, pale light. We are afraid because we remember. We remember the fire. No, Kalen said, his voice dropping low. You're afraid because you know that if you let even one of them back in, one man, one different thought, one discord, your perfect little cage falls apart. You're not protecting Ondaris. You're protecting your own power. He pressed the play button on the slate. At first, there was only static. Then the voice of Elias Thorne filled the chamber. But it wasn't just his voice. Kalen had looped the audio, layering it with the sounds of Earth, the roar of a city, the crash of an ocean, the laughter of a crowd, and the mournful wail of a cello. It was a wall of sound. It was messy, beautiful, and profoundly human. The elders recoiled as if they had been struck. The resonance shattered. The harmonic frequency was torn to pieces by the sheer, uncurated volume of the human experience. The amber cage began to flicker, the golden mist dissipating as the spire's acoustics were overwhelmed. Lyranah's eyes snapped open. She gasped, her skin regaining its color as the sedative was stripped away by the sound. "Stop it!" Arisve shrieked, her regal composure finally breaking, her face contorted with a raw, ugly rage that looked exactly like the chaos she claimed to despise. "Shut it off!" She lunged at Kalen, her hands reaching for the slate. But Lyranah was faster. She leaped from the collapsing cage, her feet hitting the stone with a solid thud. She grabbed a ritual staff from a nearby stand and swept Arisve's legs out from under her. The sage fell, her silver hair spilling across the stone like spilled milk. The elders were in chaos. Some were weeping, others were covering their ears, and a few were simply staring at the hologram projected from the slate. A grainy, 5,000-year-old image of a blue planet hanging in the dark. Kalen grabbed Lyranah's hand. "We've got to move, kid. On the double." They ran for the balcony. Behind them, the spire groaned. The central crystal, unable to process the discordant input, began to fracture. Cracks of light spread through the floor. "Why did you come back?" Lyranah shouted over the roar of the collapsing spire. "Because I'm a stubborn idiot," Kalen yelled back. "And because you're right, this world is too cold." They reached the railing. Below them, the village was waking up. The silence was over. Women were stepping out of their houses, looking up at the spire, their faces filled with a confusion that was rapidly turning into something else. Curiosity, fear, life. Kalen looked at the data slate. 1%. He looked at Lyranah. She was breathing hard, her golden eyes bright with a fire he had never seen in any Veselari. She wasn't a porcelain doll anymore. She was a survivor. "We have to get to the lower valleys," Kalen said. "The Vanguard will be hunting us, and Arisve isn't going to let this slide. We're officially Fubar, Lyra." "Fubar?" she asked, the word strange on her tongue. "Fouled up beyond all recognition," he translated with a grin. "It's a military term for, we're in a lot of trouble." Lyranah looked at the crumbling spire, then at the sunrise beginning to bleed over the horizon. Then she looked at Kalen and smiled. A real, messy, human smile. "I think I like being Fubar," she said. They leaped from the balcony just as the spire's levitation field failed. They plummeted through the mist, caught by the safety vines of the lower levels, as the great spire of Ethelgard came crashing down into the abyss. The sound of the impact echoed through the mountains, a thunderous boom that drowned out the lightning. For the first time in 5,000 years, Ondaris was loud. Kalen pulled Lyranah into a hidden alcove as the first of the Vanguard flyers roared overhead. He checked his shoulder. The burn was deep, and he was losing blood. He felt the darkness tugging at the edges of his vision. "Stay with me, Voss," he whispered. "You haven't finished the mission yet." He leaned his head against the cold stone. He had broken their world. He had forced his way into their sanctuary and shattered their peace. He was the monster Arisve had warned them about. But as Lyranah tore a strip of her own robe to bind his wound, her hands steady and her eyes clear, Kalen realized that he hadn't just brought the fire. He had brought the light. The question was, Would it be enough to save them when the rest of the galaxy finally noticed the noise? The thunder that rolled across the valleys of Honduras 2 hours after the fall of the Great Spire was not born of clouds or static. It was the sound of the atmosphere being beaten into submission by fusion torch engines. Kalen Voss, leaning heavily against Lyra Na in a shallow cave 300 meters below the spire's jagged remains, recognized that sound. It was the roar of a Sol-Terran hegemony dropship, a sound he had once associated with safety and the weight of an empire. Now it sounded like the slamming of a coffin lid. "Sit rep, Voss," he muttered, his voice catching in a throat raw from dust and screaming. Sky is falling. Again. He squinted through the haze of the valley. High above, through the electric white clouds, 3 jagged silhouettes emerged. They weren't the graceful, organic shapes of the Vi Solari. They were brutalist slabs of matte gray alloy, bristling with sensor arrays and point defense cannons. They looked like knives being plunged into the soft, purple flesh of the world. "Are those your people?" Lyra Na asked. She was shivering, her skin a pale, flickering silver that showed her distress. The golden eyes that had once looked at Kalen with wonder were now wide with a primal terror. The silence had been her cradle, and Kalen had just kicked it into the abyss. "Yeah," Kalen said, his hand tightening around the strap of his torn flight suit. "The cavalry has arrived, but they don't look like they're here for a rescue mission. They're coming in hot, full combat spread." He watched as the leading dropship, a massive Orca-class carrier, began its descent toward the plaza of Ethelgard. It didn't navigate the winding canyons or respect the flight paths of the local fauna. It simply burned its way through, its thermal wash incinerating the bioluminescent trees and turning the purple moss into black ash. The scream of its engines drowned out the waterfall, the birds, and the very heartbeat of the village. They reached a ledge overlooking the plaza. The scene below was a vision of a world being broken. The Vi Solari women, hundreds of them, were scattered across the stone walkways. Some were on their knees, their hands over their ears, while others, the vanguard warriors, were desperately trying to aim their radiant spears at the descending metal behemoth. The Orca hit the ground 50 meters from the mother flower. The force of the landing cracked the ancient stone plaza, sending shards of marble flying like shrapnel. Before the dust had even settled, the heavy assault ramps hissed open. Kalen felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Out of the darkness of the ship's hold stepped the ground pounders. Sol-Terran Marines in full Mark 9 powered armor. They looked like walking tanks, their visors reflecting the dying light of the planet. They didn't move with grace. They moved with a heavy, mechanical certainty. Behind them came the drones, sleek, hovering discs with underslung Vulcan cannons, their red sensor eyes scanning for targets. "Identify yourself," a voice boomed from the Orca's external speakers, amplified to a deafening volume. This world is now under the jurisdiction of the Sol-Terran hegemony. Any resistance will be met with lethal force. Kalen saw Eris Vey step forward from the shadows of the council hall. She looked small, her silver hair whipping in the hot wind from the engines. She raised her staff, a defiant shimmer of azure light flickering at its tip. "You are the chaos!" she shrieked, though her voice was barely a whisper against the mechanical roar. "You are the fire that never ends. Leave this place." The lead Marine didn't even pause. He raised a heavy pulse rifle. "Hostile detected," a voice crackled over the Marine's external comms, audible even from the ledge. "Neutralizing." "No!" Kalen roared, but his voice was lost in the wind. A single, brilliant bolt of red energy punched through the air. It hit the stone at Eris Vey's feet, the explosion throwing her backward. She didn't die, but she lay still, her staff shattered into 2 pieces. The rest of the warriors froze, their spears wavering. They had spent 5,000 years perfecting the art of the silence, and they had no defense against a civilization that spoke in the language of high explosives. Kalen gripped Lyrana's shoulder. "We have to go down there. Now." "Are you crazy?" she cried. "They will kill us both." "They won't kill me," Kalen said, his eyes hard. "I'm a lieutenant. I'm an asset. And as long as I'm standing between them and you, they might just listen. It's a long shot, Lyra. A real Hail Mary. But it's the only play we've got." They scrambled down the mountain paths, Kalen's military training taking over, even through the fog of pain. He knew the patrol patterns of the hegemony. He knew how they cleared a landing zone. He timed their descent, moving through the smoke and the shadows of the burning forests. By the time they reached the edge of the plaza, the village was under total lockdown. Marines were herding the women into the center of the circle, using low-frequency sonic emitters to keep them disoriented and docile. The air smelled of burnt ozone and the scorched, sweet sap of the trees. Kalen stepped out from behind a stone pillar, his hands raised high. He kept Lyra Na behind him, his body shielding her from the red sensor eyes of the drones. "Cease fire!" Kalen screamed, his voice cracking. "This is Lieutenant Kalen Voss, ID number 764 Alpha Niner. I am the pilot of the downed Star Skipper. Do not fire." The drones swiveled instantly, their cannons whirring as they locked onto him. Two Marines stepped forward, their rifles leveled at his chest. "State your authentication code, Lieutenant," the lead Marine barked, his voice distorted by his helmet synthesizer. "Voss, Kalen. Authorization." "Ironclad Blue," Kalen replied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I have critical intel on this sector. Lower your weapons." The Marines paused. There was a moment of agonizing silence as they checked his biometrics through their HUDs. Then slowly they lowered their rifles. "Authentication confirmed," the Marine said. "Welcome back from the dead, Lieutenant. You're a lucky son of a gun. The brass thought you were space dust." A tall officer in a crisp black uniform stepped out from the Orca. He wasn't wearing armor, just a long coat and a peaked cap that shadowed his eyes. Colonel Holloway. Kalen recognized him from the briefing rooms on Mars, a man who looked at planets like they were spreadsheets. "Lieutenant Voss," Holloway said, his voice as cold as a vacuum. "You've caused quite a stir. That signal you sent through the old Vanguard beacon, it lit up the whole sector. We've been looking for a gateway into this cluster for 3 decades. "Sir, the locals," Kalen started, gesturing toward the huddling women. "They aren't hostiles. They're a pacifist colony. They've been isolated for thousands of years. They saved my life." "Pacifists?" Holloway walked toward the mother flower, his boots crunching on the fallen petals. He reached out and touched the wilting velvet. "This world is a biological goldmine, Lieutenant. The spores, the energy signatures. It's a self-sustaining ecosystem with no heavy industry. The hegemony needs a garden world like this, a place to refit and resupply." "Sir, you don't understand," Kalen said, stepping closer. "The ecosystem is tied to them. If you disrupt their culture, if you force them into the hegemony mold, you'll kill the planet. It's already dying. They need help, not occupation." Holloway turned to look at Kalen, his eyes sharp and devoid of empathy. "We aren't here for a cultural exchange, Voss. We're here for the resource. And as for these females, they represent a unique genetic anomaly. 5,000 years of parthenogenesis? The labs on Terra will have a field day with them." Kalen felt a surge of nausea. He looked back at Lyra Na. She was staring at Holloway with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She didn't need a translator to understand the colonel's intent. "Is this what you wanted?" she whispered, her voice a ghost in his mind. "Is this the sky you promised?" Kalen felt the weight of his uniform like a chain around his neck. He looked at the Marines, his brothers in arms, and then at the women of Andoris, who had healed his wounds and shared their last secrets with him. He saw the drones circling like vultures over the dying mother flower. The humanistic theme he had been wrestling with, the idea that diversity was the only thing keeping the universe from stagnating into a gray void, finally crystallized. He saw the hegemony for what it was, a mirror image of the silence. One was a cage of peace, the other a cage of order. Both were death. "I can't let you do this, sir," Kalen said, his voice quiet but steady. Holloway laughed, a short, dry sound. "You can't let me? Lieutenant, you're a pilot with a broken leg and a concussion. You're going to get on that ship, you're going to get a med kit, and you're going to be a hero. Don't make this difficult." "I'm not a hero," Kalen said. He reached into his suit and pulled out the data slate. "And I'm not finished with my mission." He looked at Lyra Na and gave her a small, sad nod. He had planted the seeds of the fire. Now he had to make sure they burned the right things. "Colonel, you said that signal lit up the sector," Kalen said, his eyes locked on Holloway's. "But I didn't just send it to you. I sent it on an open frequency. A wide band, unencrypted burst. Holloway's smile vanished. What did you say? The hegemony isn't the only one looking for new paths, Kalen said. The Outrim Alliance, the independent traders, the free systems, they all heard the call. In about 6 hours, this system is going to be very, very crowded. You can occupy this world, sir. But you can't keep it a secret. Not anymore. Holloway's face turned a deep, angry purple. You traitor! You've turned a strategic asset into a war zone. No, Kalen said, as the Marines stepped forward to arrest him. I've turned a cage into a crossroads. Now, if you want this world, you're going to have to negotiate for it with everyone. As they dragged him toward the Orca, Kalen looked over his shoulder one last time. Lyra Na was standing tall, her silver hair glowing in the red light of the drones. She wasn't hiding. She was looking at the Marines, at the sky, and at her own people. The silence was gone. The chaos had arrived. And in the middle of it all, a new life was beginning to breathe. The brig of the Orca was a box of reinforced titanium and flickering blue light. It was silent, but it wasn't the silence of Ondaris. It was a sterile, dead quiet that felt like being trapped inside a tomb. Kalen Voss sat on the floor, his back against the vibrating wall, watching the minutes tick away on the internal clock. 3 hours until the first of the independent fleets arrived. 3 hours of life or death for the world below. His shoulder had been patched by a medbot, but the pain was still a dull thrumming in his bones. The biostitch from the planet was fighting against the synthetic antibiotics of the hegemony, a battle for his biology that mirrored the conflict outside. The door hissed open. He expected Holloway or a pair of guards. Instead, he saw a familiar face, though it was framed by a helmet he had once trusted. Sarge? Kalen asked, looking up. Sergeant Miller, a man Kalen had flown with on 4 different tours, stepped into the cell. He signaled for the cameras to cycle off. He looked at Kalen with a mixture of pity and confusion. Voss, you really stepped in at this time, Miller said, leaning against the doorframe. The colonel is talking about a court-martial. Treason in the face of the enemy. They're going to throw you into a black hole and forget where they put the map. They aren't the enemy, Sarge, Kalen said, his voice weary. They're just people. Different people. Miller sighed, his armor clinking. They're a resource, Kalen. That's how the brass sees it. You know the drill. We find it, we flag it, we feed it to the machine. Why do you care about this one rock? It's just another ball of moss in a galaxy full of them. Because this rock is the only place that didn't try to kill me the moment I arrived, Kalen said. And because they were doing just fine until we showed up with our guns and our spreadsheets. We're going to strip them bare, Miller. We're going to turn them into a laboratory experiment. Is that what we signed up for? Miller looked away, his jaw tightening. We signed up to follow orders. Orders don't make you right, Kalen said. They just make you a tool. I was a tool for 32 years. I'm done. The ship suddenly groaned, a deep metallic shudder that vibrated through the floor. The lights flickered and turned red. Proximity alert, Kalen whispered, a small smile touching his lips. They're here. The comms on Miller's shoulder erupted into a frantic chatter. Multiple warp signatures detected. Sector 459. Identification. Independent merchant fleet, the Drifters. And, wait, we have a heavy cruiser coming in. It's a Valenese prime vessel. Holloway's voice cut through the static, sounding strained. All units to battle stations. Defend the perimeter. Do not let them enter the atmosphere. Miller looked at Kalen, his eyes wide. You really did it. You started a gold rush. I started a conversation, Kalen said, standing up despite the pain. Miller, if Holloway starts a fire down there, he's going to destroy the very thing he wants. You have to get me back to the surface. I can't do that, Voss. That's a one-way ticket to a firing squad. Miller, look at me, Kalen said, stepping into the sergeant's space. You have a daughter, right? Sarah? She's what, 12 now? 11, Miller corrected him. What would you do if a ship landed in your backyard and told her she was a genetic anomaly to be studied? What would you do if they told her she had no right to her own home because they needed the soil? Miller stared at Kalen for a long, agonizing moment. The sound of the ship's point defense cannons began to thump in the distance. The hegemony was firing warning shots at the new arrivals. The situation was foobar. You always were a pain in the neck, Voss, Miller muttered. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small magnetic key. He swiped it across Kalen's restraints, and the metal cuffs fell to the floor with a heavy clang. There's a stealth shuttle in Hangar Bay 3, Miller said, his voice low. It's prepped for a scout run. If you're fast, you can override the launch sequence before the deck officer notices. Why are you doing this? Kalen asked. Because my daughter likes gardens, Miller said, his voice gruff. Now get moving before I change my mind and shoot you myself. Kalen didn't wait. He ran through the flickering halls of the Orca, a ghost in the machine of the hegemony. He reached Hangar Bay 3, his heart pounding in his throat. The stealth shuttle, a sleek, needle-like craft, was sitting on the pad, its engines humming in standby mode. He scrambled into the cockpit. The familiar smell of recycled air and heated electronics greeted him. He bypassed the security protocols, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. Launch in 5, 4, 3. The shuttle shot out of the bay, the inertial dampeners struggling to keep up with the sudden acceleration. Below him, the battle was already beginning. The sky was filled with the streaks of fusion trails and the brilliant flashes of shielding being hit. The hegemony ships were trying to block the independent vessels, a chaotic dance of metal and fire. Kalen dove toward the planet, the shuttle's stealth plating soaking up the sensor sweeps. He headed straight for Ethelgard. The village was a mess. The Marines had pulled back toward the plaza, forming a defensive perimeter around the Orca. The Vasilari women were being kept in the council hall, guarded by drones. Kalen landed the shuttle in the red thicket, 3 kilometers from the village. He jumped out, his boots hitting the crystalline soil. The metallic mist was thicker now, tasting of copper and fear. He ran toward the village, his eyes searching for Lyra Na. He found her at the edge of the forest near the waterfall. She was alone, holding a piece of her shattered staff, looking up at the burning sky. Kalen, she cried, running toward him. You came back. I told you I'm a stubborn idiot, he said, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace. Listen to me. The sky is full of people now, not just the hegemony, traders, scientists, explorers. They aren't all like Holloway. Some of them will want to help. But the fire, she said, gesturing toward the plaza, they are fighting over us. Let them fight, Kalen said. While they're busy with each other, we're going to talk to the others. We're going to make sure Andres has a voice. He led her toward the village, but they were stopped by a figure emerging from the smoke. Eris Vey. Her face was burnt, her silver hair singed, but her eyes were brighter than Kalen had ever seen them. The silence was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. You have destroyed us, Kalen Voss, she said. I've changed you, Eris Vey, Kalen replied. There's a difference. She looked at him, then at Lyra Na, then at the ships clashing in the heavens. You brought the chaos to our door. You forced us to see what we had forgotten. Is it so bad? Kalen asked. To be seen? To be heard? Eris Vey walked toward him, her footsteps steady on the ash. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers were no longer cold. They were warm with the fever of the planet. It is terrifying, she whispered, but for the first time in 5,000 years, I am not bored. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the plaza. One of the hegemony's drones had been hit, crashing into the mother flower. The great plant erupted in a ball of golden fire, sending a massive cloud of glowing spores into the air. The women of the village cried out, a sound of collective grief that shook the very cliffs. It's over, Lyra Na wept. The mother is gone. Kalen looked at the fire, then at the spores drifting across the valley. They weren't gray anymore. They were brilliant, shimmering gold, caught in the wind and spreading toward the charred forests. No, Kalen said, his eyes wide. Look. As the spores touched the black ash, green shoots began to erupt from the ground. It wasn't the stagnant blue moss of the past. It was something new, a wild, vibrant growth that seemed to thrive on the heat of the fire. The mother didn't die, Kalen realized. She was waiting. She needed the friction. She needed the discord to break her seeds open. He looked at Eris Vey. She was staring at the new growth, her mouth hanging open. The silence had been a winter. Kalen had brought the spring, and it was a spring born of fire and blood. The choice was no longer about whether to stay or leave. It was about what to build in the ruins. Kalen Voss, lieutenant of the Sol Terran hegemony, took off his flight jacket and threw it into the fire. He stood with the women of Ondaris, a lone man in a world of new life. The sky was still burning, the ships were still fighting, but on the ground the first notes of a new song were being sung. It was a loud song, it was a messy song. And for the first time in history, it was a song they were all singing together. "I'm staying," Kalen said, his voice carrying through the valley. Lyra Na took his hand. "Then we have a lot of work to do, pilot." Eris Vey looked at them both, a faint wise smile touching her lips. "Then let us begin," she said. "The silence is over. It is time for the world to speak." The smoke from the mother flower's remains did not drift into the sky. It clung to the ground like a heavy golden blanket, a physical manifestation of 5,000 years of suppressed energy finally released. Kalen Voss stood at the center of the shattered plaza, his legs shaking but his gaze fixed on the heavy assault ramps of the Orca. Beside him, Lyra Na held a fragment of her charred staff, her skin pulsing with a rhythmic, vibrant amber that signaled the end of her biological sedation. The standoff was a perfect, crystalline moment of tension. On one side, the Sol Terran Marines stood like metal statues, their red sensor eyes reflecting the fire. On the other, the Vesalari women were beginning to stand up, their faces no longer masks of serene indifference, but vivid with a kaleidoscope of raw, messy emotions. And above them all, the sky was a chaotic tapestry of engine flares as the independent merchant fleet and the Vyloni's prime cruisers entered low orbit. Colonel Holloway stepped off the ramp, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic fury. He looked at the new green shoots erupting from the ash, then at the crowded heavens. "You've created a total cluster event, Lieutenant," Holloway said, his voice amplified by his collar mic. "Do you have any idea what the diplomatic fallout of this is going to be? You've invited every scavenger and pirate in the sector to a hegemony discovery zone. This is a grade A snafu, and your name is written all over it in permanent ink." Kalen took a step forward, his boots crunching on the marble shards. "It's not a discovery zone anymore, Colonel. It's a sovereign world. And as for the fallout, I'd say it looks a lot like a future. Look around you. The silence is broken. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube." Holloway gestured to his Marines. "Secure the lieutenant. We're leaving this rock before the drifter fleet start dropping boarding pods. We'll settle the jurisdiction in a court-martial." "Wait!" Eris Vey's voice rang out. It was no longer a telepathic whisper. It was a loud, sharp command that cracked through the air like a whip. The sage walked through the golden mist, her singed robes trailing behind her. She did not look like a defeated leader. She looked like a woman who had just woken up from a very long, very boring dream. She stood between Kalen and the Marines, her golden eyes locked on Holloway. "Your men will not take him," Eris Vey said, "and they will not take this world. You speak of jurisdiction and resources as if we are stones in a quarry, but we have found our voices again, and the first thing we are saying is no." Holloway scoffed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm. "With all due respect, Sage, you don't have the heavy lifting to back that up. My drones could level this village in 10 minutes. "Perhaps," Eris Vey replied, her voice cooling into a dangerous edge. "But the ships in your sky are watching. They are not here to help you. They are here because Kalen Voss told them that Ondaris is a place of wonder. If you fire a single shot, you will be starting a war with half the sector. Are you prepared to explain that to your command?" Holloway paused. He looked up at the sky, where the flashing lights of a dozen different factions were now visible even through the haze. He was a man of logic, and the logic was currently foobar. He couldn't win a fight against the entire neighborhood while standing in the middle of a biological powder keg. "Fine," Holloway spat, turning back toward the Orca. "We'll go firm on the perimeter for now. But don't think this is over, Voss. You're still a traitor to the uniform." "I'll take that over being a tool for a grave robber any day," Kalen muttered as the colonel retreated into the ship. As the Marines pulled back, forming a wary circle around their landing craft, the village of Ethelgard began to breathe in a way Kalen had never felt before. It wasn't the rhythmic, artificial breathing of a machine. It was the ragged, uneven gasping of a living thing. Lyrna grabbed Kalen's arm. Her touch was hot, almost feverish. What happens now? The mother is gone. The sky is full of strangers. Are we free? Kalen looked at the new growth at their feet. The shoots were already 10 centimeters high, their leaves a dark, defiant green. We're something, Lyra. We're in the soup for sure. But for the first time in 5,000 years, the recipe is up to you. The next 72 hours were a blur of high-stakes diplomacy and biological upheaval. Kalen acted as a bridge, his battered data slate serving as the primary translation hub for the first wave of independent captains who landed in the valley. They were a diverse lot, scruffy traders in grease-stained coveralls, academic researchers from the Inner Rim, and even a few wide-eyed explorers who just wanted to see the world of the silence. Kalen watched as Arisve met with Captain Alara of the merchant fleet. The contrast was staggering. The tall, regal sage in her glowing robes, and the short, stocky human woman with a cybernetic eye and a voice like a foghorn. So you're telling me you ladies have been living on flower dust and meditation for 5 millennia? Captain Alara asked, leaning against a stone pillar. No offense, but that sounds like a real snooze fest. Where's the music? Where's the friction? Arisve tilted her head, her golden eyes tracking the movement of the captain's cybernetic eye. We sought the silence to avoid the fire, she said. We thought that by removing the discord, we could achieve perfection. Ilara laughed, a deep, hearty sound that made several nearby Vaisalari jump. Perfection is for the dead, Sage. Life is a mess. It's supposed to be loud. It's supposed to hurt sometimes. That's how you know you're still moving. Kalen sat on a nearby rock, his shoulder aching, watching the interaction. This was the real work, not the flying, not the fighting, but the slow, painful process of two different worlds trying to find a common language. He saw Lyrana talking to a young technician from a research vessel, their hands moving in the air as they compared Earth's digital tech to Ondaras's bioluminescent networks. He realized then that Arisve's silence hadn't just been a cultural choice. It had been a biological prison. The spores had been a dampener, a way to keep the population from evolving, from questioning, from becoming individuals. But now, with the mother flower's primary bloom destroyed and the atmospheric chemistry changing, the Vaisalari were waking up. He saw women arguing for the first time, not fighting but debating, their voices rising in pitch, their skin flushing with color. He saw a weaver drop her shuttle and cry, not in pain, but in frustration, and then laugh when she realized she could just start over. The plague of chaos was spreading, and it was the most beautiful thing Kalen had ever seen. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the cliffs, Kalen found Arisve standing at the edge of the abyss, looking down at the valley. The new forest was glowing with a fierce emerald intensity. It is changing so fast, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I can feel the planet's heart. It is beating faster. It is hungry. Kalen stood beside her. Change is scary, Sage. Believe me, I know. I spent my whole life in a cockpit, following a flight path someone else drew for me, coming here, crashing. It was the first time I didn't know where I was going. And now, she asked, looking at him, do you know where you're going? Kalen looked at the orca, which was still sitting in the plaza like a stubborn gray tooth. He looked at the diverse ships scattered across the valley. I'm staying here, he said. Someone has to make sure the hegemony doesn't try to pave over this garden, and someone has to help Lyrana and the others navigate the noise. You would give up your sky for us? Kalen smiled, a tired but genuine expression. I'm not giving up the sky, Arisve. I'm just changing my perspective. Besides, I think I've done enough flying for one lifetime. I'd like to see what happens when the seeds I planted actually start to bloom. Arisve reached out and took his hand. Her grip was strong, and her skin was warm, a human warmth that had finally returned to her people. You are a strange, loud, chaotic creature, Kalen Voss. But perhaps that is exactly what the silence needed. As they stood there in the moonlight, a single brilliant star moved across the heavens. It wasn't a ship, and it wasn't a moon. It was the first probe from the Independent Science Council, a tiny light in the dark, signaling that the world of Ondaris was finally, truly part of the galaxy. The dawn was coming, and for the first time in 5,000 years, it wasn't going to be quiet. 2 years had passed since the star skipper Mark 7 had torn the sky open over Ondaris. Kalen Voss stood on the balcony of his home, a structure that was half-carved stone and half-grown timber, a synthesis of Earth's geometry and Ondaris's biology. The village of Ethelgard was no longer a cluster of isolated nests. It had become a sprawling, vibrant hub of activity. Bridges of carbon fiber now hummed alongside vines of woven light, and the plaza was a bustling marketplace where traders from a dozen systems bartered for biomedical spores and resilient emerald timber. Kalen was no longer wearing his Solterran flight suit. He wore a simple tunic of leaf-spun silk and trousers of durable synth hide. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and a faint, silver scar ran down his cheek, a permanent reminder of the day the silence broke. He watched as a group of children ran past the balcony. They were a sight that would have been impossible 2 years ago. Most were Vae Solari, but among them were 3 human children, the sons and daughters of the first permanent researchers who had moved to the planet. They played together without hesitation, their laughter a chaotic, beautiful symphony that echoed between the cliffs. Kalen walked down to the plaza, his limp almost gone thanks to the continued use of the planet's biohealing. He passed a group of weavers who were no longer working in silent synchronization. They were listening to a recording of ancient Earth jazz, their hands moving to the erratic, soulful beat as they created tapestries that blended geometric patterns with the flowing lines of the forest. "Hey, Voss!" a voice called out. Kalen turned to see Sergeant Miller, now retired from the hegemony and serving as the head of the Ondaris Security Cooperative. He was wearing civilian clothes, but he still carried himself with the rigid posture of a career soldier. "How's the crop looking, Starfather?" Miller asked with a grin. Kalen chuckled at the nickname the locals had given him. "The emerald timber's coming in strong, Miller. Another 3 months and we'll have enough to trade for those water purifiers the Vilonis fleet promised us. How's the perimeter?" "Quiet," Miller said, leaning against a stone wall. "The hegemony still has a scout ship in orbit, just watching. But they know better than to touch us. The Independent Oversight Committee has too many eyes on this rock now. We're officially a protected sanctuary of cultural exchange." "It's a mouthful," Kalen said. "It's a future," Miller replied, his gaze softening as he watched his daughter, Sarah, talking to Lyra Na near the central fountain. "My kid's learning the resonance, Kalen, but she's adding her own notes. She says it's more fun when it's not perfect." Kalen nodded. That was the secret. The new resonance wasn't about a single, perfect frequency. It was about the harmony of 1,000 different voices, all singing their own songs, yet somehow creating something bigger than themselves. He walked toward the center of the plaza, where the new mother loom stood. It wasn't a single flower anymore. It was a grove of interconnected trees, their branches woven together to form a living cathedral. In the center sat Lyra Na, now a young woman of 21, her skin a steady, radiant amber. She was the lead harmonizer, the bridge between the old ways and the new. She looked up as Kalen approached, and her golden eyes sparkled with a fierce intelligence. "The first seeds of the Terran jasmine have taken, Kalen," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They are bonding with the yellow spores. The scent is complicated. It is not peaceful, but it is very, very sweet." Kalen reached out and touched a leaf of the new plant. It was a hybrid, a beautiful, messy biological experiment, much like the world they were building. "Complexity is good, Lyra. It makes the roots deeper." He spent the afternoon working in the nursery, his hands covered in the dark, nutrient-rich soil of Ondaris. He wasn't barking orders or flying through the dark. He was planting, pruning, and nurturing. He was a gardener of the soul. As the suns began to set, painting the sky in shades of golden fire, Kalen walked to the edge of the cliffs. He looked out over the valley, where the lights of the new settlements were beginning to twinkle. He saw the silhouettes of ships rising and falling on the horizon, carrying the gifts of Ondaris to the stars, and bringing the wonders of the stars to Ondaris. He felt a deep, profound sense of peace, not the hollow, medicated peace of the silence, but the hard-earned peace of a man who had finally found his place in the universe. Kalen sat on a stone bench and pulled out his old data slate. It was completely dead now, its circuitry fried beyond repair. He looked at the cracked screen, seeing his own reflection in the dark glass. He thought about the man who had fallen from the sky, the soldier who thought the world was a map to be conquered, a resource to be managed. He realized that he hadn't just saved the Veselari, they had saved him. They had taught him that the noise he so feared, the conflict, the difference, the raw vulnerability of being human, was the only thing that made life worth living. They had shown him that a perfect cage is still a cage, and that the only way to truly fly is to embrace the chaos of the fall. Kalen looked up at the same stars he had spent 32 years trying to dominate. Now they were just lights in a sky that belonged to everyone. He thought of Elias Thorne and the countless others who had been lost in the dark, and he hoped that wherever they were, they could hear the music Ondaris was making. He stood up, his bones aching with a satisfying fatigue. He walked back toward the village, his steps steady on the stone. He passed Aris Vey, who was sitting with a group of children, telling them a story. It wasn't the story of the silence. It was the story of the man who brought the fire. Kalen smiled. He wasn't a hero and he wasn't a god. He was just a pilot who had finally found a place to land. I spent most of my life thinking the universe was a math problem. If you had enough fuel, enough thrust, and a clear enough flight path, you could get anywhere you wanted to go. I thought diversity was just another variable to be managed, a potential friction point in the smooth operation of the hegemony's grand design. I lived in a cockpit of certainty, never realizing that I was as trapped in my own silence as the women of Ondaris were in theirs. But standing here now, with the dirt of a 1,000-year-old world under my fingernails and the voices of a dozen different cultures in my ears, I realize how wrong I was. The friction isn't the problem, it's the point. It's the spark that keeps the engine of life from seizing up. I look at Lyrana, I look at Miller's daughter, and I see a future that is messy, loud, and entirely unpredictable. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the turbulence. I understand now that we aren't meant to be perfect. We're meant to be many. We're meant to be the discord that makes the music real. I didn't just crash on this planet. I broke through the viewport of my own narrow mind. I lost my ship, my rank, and my old life. But in the ruins of that fire, I finally found a soul that wasn't just a serial number. For 5,000 years, the people of this world chose a perfect silence over the messy noise of life, thinking they were protecting themselves from the fire. I wonder, in your own life, have you ever chosen the safety of a quiet cage over the chaotic beauty of being truly yourself? What would happen if you finally decided to let the world hear your own unique discord? Kalen Voss turned away from the setting suns and walked back into the vibrant, noisy heart of his home. He picked up a handful of seeds, mixed and diverse, and pressed them gently into the waiting earth.